How to Lie with Statistics was published in 1954 as a field guide for spotting how numbers can be used to distort the truth. It also works as an early manual for critical thinking, a reminder that data is only as honest as the methods behind it. That message matters even more today when so many of our decisions depend on information we assume to be neutral and accurate. A good example is how inflation is presented. Most people have a sense that the official numbers don't fully capture the real experience of rising prices, the same way most of us accept that planned obsolescence is a normal part of modern business. It's widely understood, even if rarely discussed. Stick around today and we'll break down not just how inflation data can be shaped or softened, but why it happens and what that means for investors watching the precious metals market. If you value original insights and weekly videos like this, please consider subscribing. Your support makes all the difference in our ability to bring new ad-free content to the channel each week. Thank you. Inflation is a tricky subject for a lot of reasons. In the United States, we boil it down to an average inflation number meant to describe the cost of living. But stop and think for a moment. What is the cost of living exactly? It's food, shelter, clothing, medical care, insurance, energy, transportation, a whole constellation of expenses that looks different for almost everyone. The spending habits of a young man starting a family won't resemble those of an older man preparing for retirement. Maybe the young man rents an apartment in the city and gets around by subway. Maybe the older gentleman owns a home, drives a car, pays insurance, and carries the financing costs that come with it. Their realities overlap in concept, but not in scale, and certainly not in price sensitivity. So if you're the one tasked with measuring inflation for an entire country, your first challenge is building a representative cost of living that somehow captures most people's experience. Some pieces seem straightforward. The price of eggs, milk, and meat. Everyone has to eat. For shelter, you might track median home values or average rent, but even here, the details get complicated fast. Things get out of hand quickly in a country as large and varied as the United States. In parts of Florida, you can already see the early signs of a property bust, with home prices flattening or even slipping. Meanwhile, in Wyoming, home values have climbed more than 5% over the past year, according to CNBC. The same story plays out at the gas pump. Drivers in San Francisco pay well over $4.50 a gallon, while Texans are filling up for around $2.70. It's easy to throw our hands up and say the government lies about inflation, and we'll get into that. But it also wouldn't be honest to ignore the actual challenge of capturing a single inflation number that accurately reflects a country this diverse. Some amount of error is inevitable. The problem is the type of error the government has chosen to normalize. That error consistently pushes inflation lower than what people actually feel. And when inflation is understated long enough, the consequences aren't just academic, they can be ruinous for a country. Back in May of 2024, we released a video called How to Guard Against Hyperinflation Past and Present. If you haven't seen it, the lessons are still relevant. Turkey, one of the world's top 20 economies, has been grappling with severe inflation for years. Prices peaked at more than 75% in 2024, and when you zoom out over a 3-year stretch, the total inflation rate sits at roughly 290%. As the lira kept losing value, everyday people did what humans have always done when their currency fails. They turned to precious metals. Gold was the first refuge, the traditional hedge. But when the Turkish government restricted gold imports to slow the outflow of capital, people pivoted to silver, with monthly average silver imports rising to 35% year over year, according to this past August's numbers. Demand surged because silver was simply more accessible. And while inflation in Turkey has cooled this year, it says a lot about the situation that it dropped to roughly 32% is considered progress. That's the kind of improvement only a country under constant price pressure can understand. Elected officials have every incentive to downplay the effects of inflation. Some of those incentives are pragmatic and, in theory, benefit the public. Others benefit the government far more than the public living under its policies. Either way, the outcome is the same: a strong political motive to keep the headline numbers as tame as possible. And one of the simplest ways to do that is to build a measurement system that, by design, pulls the reported inflation rate lower than what households actually feel. The US government relies on chain-weighted inflation and average pricing across a basket of goods, both of which tend to smooth out and ultimately lower the inflation we actually experience. Chain weighting works by substituting a cheaper item when a more expensive one rises in price. If ground beef gets too expensive, the calculation quietly shifts weight toward a different protein like chicken, because chicken hasn't risen as fast. The logic is that this mirrors real-world behavior, where consumers swap toward cheaper alternatives as prices climb. But this approach opens a gap between CPI and the way people actually live. Substitution doesn't always happen, and in many cases it can't happen. There's no real replacement for eggs or milk. There's no substitute for electricity in regions where a single utility company holds monopoly power. And when you track specific goods over time, the cumulative price increase almost always exceeds what the CPI suggests. The index bends around substitutions. Real life doesn't. A dozen eggs in 1980 cost about 77 cents. By September 2025, the average price was $3.48. That's a cumulative increase of roughly 350%. Yet CPI over that same period shows cumulative inflation at 293%. Eggs aren't an outlier. They represent the rule. A new car is up more than 650%. Electricity has risen 348%. The cost of a home has climbed about 475%. And if those numbers sound steep, they're nothing compared to what's happening in healthcare and higher education. According to CMS.gov, healthcare expenses in 1980 came to $1,067 per person. Today, that figure sits at $14,570. That's an increase of more than 1,200%. A four-year degree at an in-state public university cost $738 in 1980. Today, Bankrate puts it at $11,610, a jump of 1,473%. These aren't rounding errors, they're reminders that the real world has inflated at a pace far beyond the official narrative. No matter where we look, the cumulative price increase of individual goods has consistently outpaced the official CPI numbers, often by a wide margin. Of course, this is just spot checking, and maybe there's an outlier we haven't covered. So here's a challenge. If you can find anything in the CPI basket that has risen less than 293% since 1980, drop it in the comments below. We genuinely like to see it. But why go to the effort of hiding the truth? What's in it for government officials? The first plausible reason actually sounds fairly benign. When stimulus checks flooded the economy in 2020, inflation took root almost immediately. Prices surged across nearly every product and service, and by 2022, the world started noticing something strange. Even after input costs fell, businesses weren't lowering their prices, they were raising them, using inflation as cover. Reporters eventually coined the term greedflation to describe what was happening. By January 2024, one think tank put numbers to it. Between April and September of 23, their research showed that corporate profits accounted for 53% of inflation. Over the 40 years before the pandemic, profits made up just 11% of that growth. The shift was massive, and companies knew it. CEOs were openly bragging on earnings calls about raising prices well beyond their actual cost increases. Inflation had become a household word, and for the less scrupulous players in corporate America, it became a little bit of a shield. A convenient excuse to push prices higher without facing any real backlash. It sounds like a good reason for the government to keep inflation readings on the low side, because acknowledging the full reality might actually make inflation worse. But there is another layer to this. Inflation also benefits lawmakers in ways that are rarely discussed. It acts as a kind of shadow tax, and it hits taxpayers twice. The first hit when the government prints money, usually by issuing debt that future taxpayers have to repay with interest. The second hit happens at the cash register. If you paid $100 last year for a new tool and the sales tax was $7, a few years of inflation might push that tool up to $110. And now your tax is $7.70. Multiply that by millions of purchases across the country, and the government quietly collects far more tax revenue without ever raising the tax rate. That extra revenue can help lawmakers deliver on campaign promises or reward political supporters. Meanwhile, the government's own expenses often grow much more slowly because benefits like Social Security and food stamps rely on cost of living adjustments tied to the reported inflation number, not the real one. Lower CPI means smaller increases in benefits, which saves the government money. And there's one more incentive. Lower reported inflation improves public sentiment and puts pressure on the Federal Reserve to ease borrowing conditions. A softer inflation number makes it more likely the Fed will lower the Fed funds rate, which reduces borrowing costs and clears the way for lawmakers to take on even more debt. In that sense, underreporting inflation becomes a self-reinforcing advantage for the people in charge. Whether you see this as a coordinated effort to manage public perception or simply the byproduct of built-in conflicts of interest, the result is the same. The official numbers underreport inflation. For precious metal investors, all of this has some pretty unique implications. On paper, gold has already broken its inflation-adjusted record high. But if the official inflation numbers are understated, and we've shown they are, then that record isn't as clear-cut as it seems. A more intuitive way to think about this is to compare gold to something real, something tangible. In 1980, you could buy the average new car for the equivalent of 8.7 ounces of gold. Today, take that same 8.7 ounces and try to buy an average new car. You can't, and it's not even close. To make the numbers line up, gold would have to be worth over $5,700 per ounce. In other words, when you measure gold in something real instead of in dollars, its inflation-adjusted high starts to look very different. Silver tells the same story. Silver broke its nominal all-time high earlier this year, and using official CPI, the inflation-adjusted record from 1980 sits around $200 per ounce. But again, that assumes the CPI is accurate. So let's do the same comparison we did with gold. At silver's peak in 1980, you needed 148 ounces to buy an average new car. If 148 ounces were enough to buy that same new car today, silver would be priced at over $330 per ounce. Comparing metals to real goods instead of official inflation data gives you a clearer picture of long-term value. And when you do that math, both gold and silver look meaningfully undervalued relative to what their historical purchasing power would suggest. These are only a few examples, and the exact number you get depends entirely on what you measure against and when. Eggs, cars, electricity, homes, healthcare, none of them are perfect stand-ins for gauging the true value of gold or silver. Each comparison tells only part of the story, but when you look at them collectively, and you consider all the evidence we've walked through, a pattern emerges. The officially reported inflation numbers consistently fall short of reality, and because of that, they also undersell the long-term potential of precious metals. That's all we have for you today. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share with a friend. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.